So when sponsoring your spouse for permanent residence of Canada, a very common question that people often have is, what the hell am I doing with my life? And once you've accepted that reality, the second most common question people have is, does the sponsor need to be employed to sponsor their spouse? And if they are employed, how much income do they need to show? And if they are unemployed, then how much funds does the sponsor need to show to prove that they can take care of their spouse once they immigrate? And so there are all these questions about the sponsor's financial requirements, and it can get a little tricky on how to locate the right answer. So in this video, as always, I'll show you how I met the sponsor requirements when I sponsored my wife, and then we can take a look at some possible scenarios and solutions. So let's look at the requirements first. So you're going to download this document checklist 5533 from your official guide 5289. This document checklist has the list of all the forms and documents that you must submit for your spousal sponsorship application. And this document checklist also has to be filled out and submitted along with the rest of your forms. So if you're looking for a general overview of this document checklist, where to download it, how to fill this out, and where to submit it, then I have a dedicated video covering all of that. It should be showing up on the cards here and it's linked in the description below. So definitely check that video out. It should give you some idea about this document checklist. Alright, in this document checklist, if you scroll down to part B, supporting documents required by the sponsor, in that section, under section 5 or item 5 is the employment or source of income bullet for your sponsor. So now this section talks about the financial requirements of the sponsor. And by the way, this does not really apply to a Quebec resident. Your application process is different. So if you are a Quebec resident, then you have to look elsewhere. So there's 2 points covered in this section 5. Let's look at them one by one. Number 1, if you are working in Canada, then the expectation from you is to provide original letter from your current employer stating your period of employment. So this is just your offer letter, your salary and regular hours per week, which will be mentioned in your offer letter, or any other supporting financial documents if you are self-employed. Okay. And along with that, you also must provide the most recent notice of assessment or your proof of income statement. So any one of these 2 documents from the CRA. So if you've been working in Canada for a while and you've done your taxes, then you know how to download your notice of assessment or your income statement. So provide either one of these and your employment letter or offer letter and your salary slips. And that should take care of the financial requirements of the sponsor if you've been working in Canada and have filed taxes before. Alright, now let's assume you have been working in Canada, but you cannot provide notice of assessment or any of the CRA documents. So this was my case. I had moved to Canada in 2021 and I had only been working for a few months when I sponsored my wife. So I had not really done my taxes at that point. I would do my taxes in 2022. So for the year of 2021, for the few months that I've been working, all I had was my offer letter from my employer and my salary slips and my bank statement with a bank balance. So what I did was to submit these documents that I had from my employer along with a letter of explanation explaining why I could not provide documents from CRA. As it says here, if you cannot provide notice of assessment or proof of income statement, basically if you cannot provide any of the 2 CRA documents mentioned here, then you must provide an explanation on a separate sheet of paper accompanied by relevant supporting financial documentation to show how you can support the person you are sponsoring. And I've actually shared that explanation letter in this video, also linked in the description below. So go to this video and in the description box of that video, I've shared the sample of that letter which I wrote to explain why I could not provide notice of assessment. And you can also watch that video. I explain the reasoning behind writing that letter and I basically explain the structure and formatting of that letter also. So it should help you out. Alright. Now, if you're not working in Canada, this is the box that you're going to select. And it says you have to provide documentation showing that you can support the person you are sponsoring, and this must include a detailed explanation of how you plan to support yourself and the person you are sponsoring on a separate sheet of paper. So this already answers the question that the sponsor doesn't really need to be employed to sponsor their spouse. Otherwise, they wouldn't have given this option in this document checklist, right? So if you're not working in Canada, meaning the sponsor is unemployed, you can still sponsor your spouse as long as you can provide proof that you can support them. So let's try to understand the sponsor's income requirements a little more. So you're going to get to this page. It's the guide 5289, official guide for sponsoring your spouse. And if you click on becoming a sponsor, as you can clearly see in the note here, it's written, in most cases, there is no low income cutoff for spouse, partner, or dependent child sponsorships. So this means that if the sponsor who's sponsoring their spouse is working in Canada, the sponsor doesn't really need to meet a minimum income criteria. There is no minimum income requirement for spousal sponsorship. So this means whatever the sponsor is earning should be fine, as long as the sponsor is not receiving social assistance for reasons other than a disability. Social assistance is just welfare. So as long as you're not receiving welfare except for disability, then whatever the sponsor is earning, whatever your income is, however low or high it might be, should still work as evidence that you can support yourself and your partner when they immigrate to Canada or when they become a PR. Now, if the sponsor is unemployed, meaning they're not working in Canada, they can still sponsor their spouse, as we just saw in the document checklist right here. You're going to uncheck this box and check this box. If you're not working in Canada, provide other documentation showing that you can support the person you're sponsoring. This must include a detailed explanation of how you plan to support yourself and the sponsored persons on a separate sheet of paper. So, if you are unemployed, meaning the sponsor is unemployed, obviously this clears up the confusion that you can still sponsor your spouse, but then you have to provide some evidence that you will be able to take care of your spouse. Okay? So, there are a couple ways to do this. The best possible way that I can think of and that most people use is to show enough funds in your bank account. As long as you have enough funds in your bank account, preferably a Canadian bank account, and readily accessible to you, then that works as good evidence to prove that you can support yourself and your spouse. Now, when using proof of funds, the most common question people have is, how much funds do I need to show? So, here's the straightforward answer. As of July 2022, there is no set amount for how much funds the sponsor needs to have in their bank account in order to sponsor their spouse. All right. So what does that mean? Does that mean you don't have to have any money in your bank account? Come on, that's just illogical. It doesn't really work, right? So if you are unemployed and you want to sponsor your spouse and you want to use proof of funds to show that you can support your spouse, then you have to have a certain amount in your bank account to prove that it's enough to take care of both of you. So what amount should you choose if there is no amount mentioned by IRCC anywhere? So let's investigate this. So I'm going to go to Google and I'm going to type proof of funds Canada PR. And I'm going to get to this page. And I'm pretty sure most of you must have already done this research and you must have also landed on this page. So this is a proof of funds requirement page. But as you can see right here, it says skilled immigrants for express entry. So right off the bat, it becomes clear that this page, the proof of funds page, is not meant for spousal sponsorship. This is meant for skilled immigrants who are coming on express entry. But just for the purpose of education, let's try to understand this page anyway. So if you scroll down on this page, there is a table mentioned here. So on the left, there's a number of family members, so basically your family size. And on the right are the funds that they require you to have when you're immigrating on express entry. So for the family size of 2, the funds required are 16,570 Canadian dollars as of 2022. Again, let me reiterate, this number is for express entry. But hypothetically speaking, let's say you're sponsoring your spouse and you don't have a dependent child. So you're just a family of 2 people. So let's say you went with this amount, meaning the sponsor is unemployed, they don't have any income, and they want to use bank balance or funds as evidence to prove that they should be able to support their spouse. And you went with this amount. So is that really wrong to show this amount, even though it doesn't really apply to spousal sponsorship? In my personal opinion, I don't think it's a bad idea to show 16,570 Canadian dollars or more in your bank account when you're sponsoring your spouse as proof of funds. Now, the good thing is, because this table doesn't really apply to spousal sponsorship, you don't really have to have exactly this amount in your bank account. You can go higher than this amount or you can go lower than this amount. It doesn't really matter because this table is not for spousal sponsorship. What I'm doing here is I'm simply using this table as a guide to understand how much money they are really expecting 2 people, a family of 2 people, to have in order to support themselves in Canada, the minimum amount they're expecting. And logically speaking, this amount, 16,570 for a family size of 2 people, works for express entry. Why can't it work for spousal sponsorship? Just imagine this scenario. You immigrate on express entry with your spouse and you immigrate on spousal sponsorship. Once you are a PR, you are a PR, and you're going to have to spend money to live in Canada, and it's pretty expensive. And believe me, by the way, this 16,570 is going to fly like that. Okay, it's pretty expensive. So by that logic, this guide should still give you some idea on how much funds to shoot for when you're not employed and you're using only funds as evidence to prove that you should be able to support your spouse. I actually use this amount, and I know so many of my subscribers have used this as a guide, even though it is not for spousal sponsorship. Granted, I also have a job when I sponsored my wife, so I had my salary slips and my income coming in regularly. So I didn't really need to show proof of funds, but I still went with this guide just for my own peace of mind. I just wanted to be safe and secure when doing the application. And so many of my subscribers have used this amount and they had no problem. So what I'm trying to say is, if you're really confused about how much money you need to show in your bank account and there's no set amount for spousal sponsorship, you can use this as a decent guide. There is no harm against that. The good news is this table is for express entry. So for spousal sponsorship, you don't really need to meet these numbers. Depending on whatever your family size is, you can go low, you can go high, depending on what you can arrange at that time. The idea is to show that you have money available in your bank, readily accessible, that can be used to fulfill the basic needs of you and your spouse. All right. Also think about it logically. You don't want to go too low than this amount. Let's say you only have a couple $100s in your bank account. That doesn't really make sense, right? How are you ever going to be able to support yourself, let alone your spouse, with just a couple $100s? So you can factor in things like cost of living of the city where you expect it to live, and what is the average cost of living for a family size of 1 or 2 or 3, depending on whatever your family size is. And then you can try to come up with a number. Trust me, that number is going to be much, much higher. This is the minimum amount they require for express entry. So if you're not employed right now and you're looking for a number, use this as a guide. I don't think it's going to hurt. Okay. Now, proof of funds is just one way you can prove that you'll be able to take care of your spouse. Let's assume you are really short on cash. Then you can still sponsor your spouse, because if you go back to the document checklist, it doesn't really give you a hard set amount that you have to show. It simply asks you that you have to provide documentation showing that you can support the person you're sponsoring. So what else can you use? Let's say you have a family in Canada. So you'll be staying with them for the foreseeable future until you can figure your situation out. So the duration for which you'll be staying with your family, you're going to be saving rent and possibly even utilities. So you can show that as proof that me and my partner won't be spending as much on rent because we have family living here. You can also show that you have assistance coming in from family. So that takes us back to the proof of funds. You can borrow money from your family, relatives or friends, put that in your Canadian bank account, and you can use that to send in your application. You can also use your advanced degrees or the skills that you have acquired back in your home country through your work experience to prove that you are very employable in the province or the city that you're moving. And then use that as evidence that you will eventually find a job, and then you will eventually be able to support yourself and your spouse. So again, when you are low on funds, then it gets a little tedious to explain convincingly that you will be able to support yourself and your spouse. The best proof, again, like I said, is to show that you have enough money in your bank account and that money is readily accessible to you. So don't overthink this proof of funds. Just use what you have and make a convincing case, and then you should be good. All right? Hope this clears your confusion.